The rain hammered down on the mansion's glass roof, a relentless rhythm that echoed through the halls like a heartbeat. Naomi, the maid who had worked there for years, pressed the damp rag harder against the oak banister she was polishing. She was used to storms, but tonight something felt heavier in the air, something darker. Her life in the Hawthorne mansion had always been defined by silence. She was the maid in the background, a black woman serving the needs of a man who had everything. Billionaire Richard Hawthorne, handsome, powerful, untouchable. The world adored him, the staff revered him, and society bowed at his feet. But Naomi knew that wealth often concealed cracks, and that night, for the first time, she glimpsed one. She had gone upstairs to deliver a tray of tea to Richard's study. The door was slightly ajar, light spilling into the hall. She knocked gently, but there was no answer. Curiosity pulled her closer. Then she saw him. Richard sat at his desk, his face pale and strained. In his trembling hands he held a small dark bottle. Naomi froze in the shadows, her breath caught in her throat as she watched him pour a few strange pills into his palm. They weren't ordinary, odd shapes and colors, nothing like the medicine she had seen before. His eyes darted around the room as though he feared invisible watchers. Then he swallowed them quickly, one after another, his body shuddering with each gulp. Naomi's stomach knotted. She wanted to turn away, to forget what she had just seen, but something about the desperation in his movements struck her deeply. This wasn't a man in control. This was a man enslaved by something unseen. She retreated quietly, her footsteps lighter than the rain, but the image burned itself into her mind. Richard, the mighty billionaire, looked less like a king and more like a prisoner. The next morning the mansion was alive with its usual routine. Chefs clattered in the kitchen, gardeners tended to the drenched lawns, and Richard came down the grand staircase as immaculate as ever, his navy suit pressed, his hair perfectly combed. To everyone else he was a picture of power. But Naomi noticed what others missed, the slight tremble in his hands, the way he gripped the banister as though it was his lifeline, the faint hollows beneath his eyes hidden poorly by charm. She tried to tell herself it wasn't her business. A maid doesn't question the master of the house. Her job was to serve, not to see. But Naomi had lived long enough to know that secrets left unchecked could destroy lives. Days turned into weeks and the pattern continued. At night, she heard him packing in his study, sometimes whispering to himself, sometimes groaning as though in pain. Once, she heard another voice, low and sinister, a man telling Richard he had no choice but to keep taking the pills. Naomi pressed her ear to the door, heart racing as she caught fragments. "You know the deal," the man growled. "Without them, your body fails. Without them, the empire crumbles. Do you want the world to see you weak?" Richard's voice cracked, "But it's killing me." Naomi's blood ran cold. The pills weren't medicine. They were chains, chains disguised as salvation. Her nights became restless. She thought of her children back home, of how she worked endless hours in this mansion to feed them, of how many times she had swallowed her pride for survival. She thought of Richard too, not as a billionaire, but as a man cornered by his own demons. She knew what it was to feel trapped, and she couldn't shake the thought that perhaps he needed saving, even if he'd never admit it. One stormy evening, Naomi gathered her courage. She knocked softly on the study door and entered with his evening tea. Richard looked up, startled, quickly shoving the bottle into a drawer. "Leave it there," he said curtly, his voice colder than usual. Naomi hesitated, then spoke, her voice trembling. "Sir, may I say something?" He frowned, unused to her speaking beyond the boundaries of service. "What is it?" I've seen you," she whispered, eyes fixed on the floor. "The pills, I know something is wrong." The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Richard's jaw clenched, his hands curling into fists on the desk. For a moment, Naomi feared he would fire her. Then, unexpectedly, his shoulders slumped and he buried his face in his hands. "You don't understand," he muttered, voice breaking. "Without them, I can't survive. My body is failing. And if I fail, everything collapses, the company, the charities, the people who depend on me. I can't be weak, not in this world. Naomi's heart ached. She stepped closer, her voice gentle yet firm. Strength doesn't come from pills, sir. It comes from facing the truth, from allowing yourself to be human. Richard lifted his eyes to her, and for the first time, Naomi saw not the billionaire but the broken man beneath. His eyes glistened with unshed tears. You don't know what it's like to carry so much, to have the world waiting for you to stumble. Naomi knelt beside his chair, her dark hands resting softly on the polished wood of his desk. I do know what it's like, she said quietly. I know what it means to have mouths to feed, to work until your body aches, to hide your pain because no one cares. I may not have your money, but I know what it is to fight. And I know one thing, you can't fight if you're poisoning yourself. Her words pierced the silence. For a long while, Richard said nothing. Then, slowly, he pulled the drawer open and placed the bottle on the desk. His hands shook as though letting it go was the hardest thing he had ever done. I don't know if I can stop, he whispered. You don't have to do it alone, Naomi replied. From that night on, a change began. It was not easy. Richard battled withdrawal, nights of sweating, shaking, and pain. He lashed out in anger, broke down in despair, but Naomi stayed. She brought him water, sat with him when the nightmares came, reminded him he was more than his empire. She became the quiet strength he never knew he needed. As weeks passed, the mansion changed too. The once cold, distant halls began to feel warmer. Staff who once only whispered of their employer's perfection now saw his humanity. And in that vulnerability, they found respect, not for his wealth but for his courage. One evening, months later, Richard stood on the balcony overlooking the gardens, his face thinner but brighter, his eyes clear for the first time in years. Naomi stood beside him, her apron dusted from the day's work, her spirit as steady as ever. You saved me, he said softly. Naomi shook her head. No, sir, you saved yourself. I just reminded you that you could. He smiled faintly, a smile not of power but of gratitude. Maybe true wealth isn't about money or power. Maybe it's about the people who stand with you when you have nothing left. Naomi's eyes glistened. She thought of her children, of the long nights she had spent believing she was invisible. Yet here she was, the maid who had saved a billionaire's life, not with riches, but with compassion. The truth behind the mansion was no longer the pills, the secrets, or the despair. It was the resilience of the human spirit, the reminder that even the strongest fall, and even the weakest can help them rise again. And as the rain cleared, leaving the world washed anew, Richard Hawthorne and Naomi both understood something profound. That courage is not in hiding your pain but in sharing it, and that sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected hands.